Okay, and we are joined today, as I said earlier, by the director of Brideshead Revisited. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us and give us something thrilling to talk about. So, we don't really know, and I don't know how many of our listeners actually know too much about this story of Brideshead Revisited. Obviously, it's quite well known, but could you just give us a quick outline of the plot?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, in summary, Brideshead Revisited is the story of Charles Ryder. Charles starts off the play as a naive undergraduate. He's rather green, I suppose we could say. And although he does have pretensions to artistic taste, and he becomes infatuated with this world of privilege and decadence that he first encounters in Oxford when he meets Sebastian Flight, who is a sort of very extravagant and hedonistic aristocrat, or at least that's the persona he wants to present to the world. And I suppose the story is about how his relationship with Sebastian, and then later on with his sister Juliet and the whole of the family, where I suppose how the relationships are self-destructive, and how all his yearning for this idyll that he thinks that they represent, how it ultimately comes to nothing, I suppose. Well, it's rather tragic in a way.
Well, and then how did you first come across this piece? Is it through reading the book, or seeing play a movie, or adaptation?
Well, I think like many people here, I read the book a few years ago, and apart from the fact that it is one of the sort of classics that everyone tells you must read,
right.
I genuinely loved it. I mean,
okay, well, it's been on my list for a long time. One of these days.
You and me both.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read it a few years ago, but it wasn't particularly in my mind. And then at some point last term, I decided that I wanted to do a play. I didn't quite know what. And then I thought, why don't I adapt Brideshead Revisited? So in a sort of whirlwind rush, I just sat down one day and I did it. And
in a day?
The first draft was written in a night, actually. Well, obviously I hope it was improved slightly in later days, expanded a bit and edited, but the essential thing was written in a day, and I hope it's faithful to the book in the important parts, but in others I've maybe gone in a slightly different direction.
And was this the first play that you put on here in Oxford? Or
the second.
Okay.
The second at Oxford. I put on One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in Michaelmas at the BT.
Okay.
That was another of my one-night adaptation jobs. But no, that's another great book. I don't know if you've read it.
Yeah, so in adapting all these great things, they must have a lot of preconceptions with the text initially, just for the audience themselves. So how do you go about tackling them?
Well, I think the main thing to do is to, well, for me, I just sit down and I think carefully about what I think the essence of the work is. So obviously, once I've worked that out, I don't stray very far away from that, because apart from the fact that it wouldn't be right, it would obviously upset a lot of people. So I suppose if we take the example of Brideshead, the backbone of the story, obviously, I'm stuck to very closely, and the main themes of religion, aestheticism, the loss of love, the search for a terrible youth, etc., etc. All these things are pretty much there.
Yeah.
And,
so when adapting it specifically for the stage, what sort of things do you take in mind? What things in staging do you introduce?
Well, what you have to think about is obviously in practical terms not to have too many changes of location, because in the book, you turn the page and you're in Morocco, and then you flick back and you're in Venice. But this doesn't quite happen on stage, and I think sometimes if in an adaptation you try to include or things like all the locations, then you run into a bit of trouble, because dramatically it just doesn't really work.
Right.
So I try to think of practical things like that. So actually we only have essentially two locations in the play, Brideshead and Oxford.
Okay.
So various scenes from other locations have been sort of transfigured into those two places. But I hope it works. And I suppose
it's going to be really interesting to see. I'm definitely going to come see now.
Yeah, that's really
interesting. Yeah. Mainly I'm just impressed that you actually just sit down and do that. I mean, I'd just be too intimidated to start. But
so inadequate in comparison.
Yeah. So you just had this great concept one night you wrote the adaptation, and then what happened next with your production process?
Well, because I'm in my first year, I don't actually, last term I didn't really know very many people in drama, and obviously when to put on a big production like this you need a producer, a marketing manager, various teams of people,
right.
And I didn't really know anyone, so I started by talking to Nay Webb, and she said she suggested that I send out this email to all the ads people and just producer wanted. I got in contact. The producer actually and I that was the first person I found for the project. And interestingly, he had tried to. Well, they were going to put on Brideshead, this other adaptation, 2 years ago as a modelling garden show. But then the venue fell through at the last minute, and he was very keen to take on the project again. So that was quite lucky, really.
Yeah.
And from then, just word of mouth, I started saying, I'm looking for a designer. I'm looking for, and I was just lucky, and we came together quite nicely.
For casting. Was there a big response from the drama community here in terms of a lot of interest?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing because before we did the auditions, I had heard horror stories, actually especially about male actors. I've been told there are none in Oxford for a start, and the same people do all the plays, the same sort of 10 people, and I mean the producer said that sometimes they've had to cast the lighting designer or something just because they don't have enough actors. So when I started sending out the various audition notices, the responses just came flooding in, and we saw nearly 100 people in the end.
Wow! Oh, wow!
So I was, it was very exciting to be able to see so much talent.
And so then, were there any things that were particularly challenging as you started to put on the production, as you started rehearsals and just sort of really figuring out how you're going to do this?
Definitely. Well, I think probably the main thing is working with, or possibly even against, this Oxford stereotype, which I think if you just say Brideshead Revisited to a lot of people who may or may not have read the book, they will just, their immediate reaction will be, sort of typical Oxford, elitist, like this whole preconception surrounding Brideshead, that it is the Oxford stereotype.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to do was essentially sort of transfigure it, because I obviously read the book again and again to try and work out what the essence is, and I don't know. I mean, others may criticise me for it, but I don't think it is essentially about the Oxford stereotype. The Oxford stereotype is simply a tool with which these very tortured characters sort of
sort of express themselves, and that's how it manifests.
Exactly.
But that's not really the root
it's
of the
part
problem.
of the persona they adopt.
Yeah.
So, for example, with Sebastian, who Charles sort of becomes infatuated with at Oxford. We sort of had to discuss at length how studied he was going to be, and we concluded that there are other characters in the play who are even more outre, even more extravagant, and who even more decidedly take on this persona and embellish it, and they sort of become this sort of Oxford stereotype,
right.
etc. But I think with him, he just uses it as a facade. So with things like the teddy bear, Aloysius, I think most people associate that with Brideshead. The fact that this 19-year-old boy goes around with his teddy bear. I mean, it's what does it mean? I mean, I suppose it represents his desire for sort of, I suppose, the innocence of childhood.
So when making decisions about the casting of the characters in a particular way, do you discuss it with the actors themselves, or as a whole cast, a whole crew?
Well, I mean, in rehearsals, I definitely subscribe to the approach that the director doesn't necessarily know any better than anyone else. So, and actors are very talented and very, some of the greatest ideas that we've come up with in rehearsal have just happened, by sort of general collaboration.
Right.
The actors have sort of said certain things about how they wanted to play the character. For example, possibly the most extravagant character in the whole play is Anthony Blanche, who is a friend of Sebastian's, and he is, I think, as I mentioned before, his persona is entirely studied. So his extravagant way of dress with these silk cravats and orchids in his buttonhole, etc. This is all. It's very, very studied. He is definitely presenting a persona to the world,
right.
And I think we decided that he was going to play him so extravagantly that it actually that the hollowness actually showed through.
Okay.
So we could see that he was actually a pretty tortured man, and he was just, all this extravagance was just an attempt to hide it from the world.
Anything else that we just absolutely must know about your production?
That's it. Well, all the stuff we've just been saying now,
yeah.
I mean, that is pretty heavy, but I hopefully think that the audience can take away something hopeful at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, I think it's a tragedy. It is about 3 characters who essentially self-destruct. But,
right.
The thing about, I suppose, the main character, Charles, is that he does come to this sort of state of self-recognition at the end about how his yearning for this idyll, it was just completely futile. So even though he came to the realization too late, I mean, at least he came to it at all, in a sense. I think there is something to take away at the end.
Yeah.
Definitely. About maybe how we shouldn't waste our lives yearning for impossible things like he did,
right.
I suppose.
And then just out of curiosity, have you thought any more about what you're going to do next? Any other adaptations that you're thinking about?
I'm brewing up.
That is an excellent question. I mean, everyone keeps asking me, what's next? And it's very difficult to move on from possibly one of the most iconic novels ever written. But I actually had a crazy idea to adapt Crime and Punishment for the stage. I mean, impossibly difficult, but I don't know. We'll see.
Always a challenge.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Well, thank you very much. And Brideshead Revisited will be on next week at Corpus Christi College. And we will have more details about that later on in the program. So thank you so much for joining us.
See you there, listeners.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Bye.